Hello, and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest today is Charbel Barakat, Chief Counsel for the Florida region for D.R. Horton Incorporated and recent Jeopardy champion. And we're going to be discussing the law of Jeopardy. So, Charbel, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Brian. It's great to be here.
Yeah, well, I'm so excited about this. As you know, I watched you on Jeopardy Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. It was, elation to you were robbed, but it was a really exciting experience. And the first friend of mine I've seen on the program, so that was really, really exciting to me. I was wondering if you could start by just telling listeners a little bit about yourself. I mean, everyone knows you're a lawyer, but sort of maybe tell people a little bit about your career path to this point.
Sure. Yeah, I'm originally from Miami, Florida, and then went to undergrad at Johns Hopkins, and that's really where my trivia career started, I guess you could say. I was on the believe it or not, there was a varsity quiz bowl team that traveled to different schools and competed against the five nerdiest people from other schools in the Northeast, and it was we were as cool as we sound.
Did you guys have like letter jackets or something? Or
I wish. Yeah, it was mostly Star Wars T-shirts, things along those lines. Yeah, magic cards, maybe something along those lines. Yeah. But we did that. That was probably my first immersion into it, and actually, that was kind of the first I'd heard a little bit, or I'd watched Jeopardy kind of growing up my whole life, but I never really thought it was something you could aspire to. But when I was at Hopkins, I was preceded by a couple years at school by a guy named Brad Rutter. Now Jeopardy folks will know the name Brad Rutter. He is the winningest Jeopardy contestant of all time. He's the only guy to be undefeated against Ken Jennings, who was maybe the most famous Jeopardy champ, even though Rutter has beat him. And Rutter is also a Johns Hopkins dropout. So he attended for a couple years ahead of me and was on the team. And his legend sort of preceded him in those days. Then he made a big run on the TV show and had a bunch of success there. And we also had a guy. And I don't remember his name, but he competed on the college tournament. And that was kind of when it first planted the seed. And then, but it was kind of the back of my mind, and went to law school at NYU and practiced there, practiced in New York for about 5 years. And you know how that the New York law firm world goes, it's sort of all consuming. So other than a couple of half-hearted attempts to audition for Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, kind of in the Regis era, the trivia dreams kind of went on the side for a while until I moved back to Florida, practicing real estate law first at a firm in Miami, and then in my current position as an in-house counsel. And probably the last 10 years, off and on, I applied 3 separate times, and third time was the charm.
Awesome. So what was that selection process like? Like, what did they expect? Do you have any sense of what they're looking for? Sort of what was your experience of actually like trying to get on the show?
Sure. So the process, it starts with or at least for that period of time, it starts with an online exam. And they say about 90,000 people take the exam. It's a 50-question exam. It's offered 3 nights out of the whole year. And of those, they select approximately 3,000 to 4,000 people to do in-person auditions somewhere around the country. It's like it's the nerd equivalent of American Idol, And at that point, they're looking for that's when you meet the Jeopardy contestant coordinators, and these are folks that they've all been with the show for about basically as long as it's been running, which is 35 years or close to it. And they know exactly what they want. And they're looking for, first they run you through another in-person exam, another 50 question quiz to make sure essentially the online exam wasn't a fluke. And then they run you through an interview and through a mock game. Essentially, the best advice you can get on for that part of the portion of the interview is just try to be as interesting as possible. So, they want folks that are standing out a little bit on TV, I guess, TV friendly folks. So as you might imagine, in the trivia world, there's a lot of really, really, really smart trivia types that they would never, ever, ever want to put on TV. So
why is that? So, I mean, what do you think? Do you have a sense of what they're looking for, or sort of what characteristics or?
It's the entertainment aspect of it. They're clearly looking for folks from around the country, representative of the country as a whole, right? They want to see viewers want to see people that look like themselves. So it's folks all shapes and sizes. Obviously, they seem to strive for relative male-female balance, all kinds of demographics, all kinds of different professions. They want to have folks from all across the country. I was told that I was the first person from the Tampa area to appear on the show in about 2.5 years. And, considering that's one of the top, I think, 20 or so media markets, that may have had something to do with why I was picked. Who knows? But, they're looking for all kinds of different things. But folks that are going to be memorable. I mean, I think there's Austin Rogers is probably the most memorable recent champion. He's I think he won about 17 games. He's a very heavily bearded bartender from Brooklyn who just seemed to know everything. I mean, kind of the epitome of the know-it-all Brooklyn bartender, right? And
was this a trivia bar? A trivia bar in Brooklyn?
Just kind of I don't even think so. I mean, I'm sure there might have been some kind of trivia night, but he just tended bar. I don't think he even ran a trivia game. I think he was just a really great bartender that happened to know a little bit of everything.
So that third test you took, was that the first time that you went to one of these screening events, or had you been to one previously?
No, that was the third time. One time I had gone to Orlando. One time I'd gone to Tampa, and then this is when I lived outside of Tampa. And then the last time was in 2016. I actually went to Washington D.C. So I hopped on a plane, and maybe that got some attention. I'm not sure. I think I was one of the folks that traveled the farthest.
They saw the commitment.
That and the seersucker suit. I think the seersucker suit
that always helps. That always helps.
Always closes the deal.
So how did you once they accepted you to be on the show, did you study or prepare in some way? And if so, do you think your kind of trivia background was helpful or harmful, or neither?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to come to it, and they're selecting for folks where there's already a sort of a base minimum of solid trivia knowledge. They want to make sure that all the questions get answered, all all the money gets taken off the board. If they see big numbers out there, folks are entertained, the game's moving fast, so they're selecting for strong trivia types. But at the same time, we all have gaps in our knowledge. And the good news is, Ken Jennings, I think, famously said that Jeopardy knowledge is many, many, many miles wide, but about an inch deep. You really got to focus on that narrow band of knowledge. And the internet being what it is, I mean, there's a website called the J Archive. Shout out to the J Archive. They have all 35 years of the Alex Trebek version of Jeopardy archived, all the questions and answers, all of the daily doubles and the amounts wagered, and it's an incredible resource. And you can do a deep dive in there and figure out, there's some very common subject matter that is that comes up over and over again, and it's sort of a finite area. So I'm thinking of things like the U.S. presidents state capitals, world leaders. Shakespeare, you really only need to have a good idea of his plays. The sonnets don't really come into it, and really even just the plays that you might think of. Opera,
No Coriolanus or anything.
yeah, it does come up. It does come up, but very rarely. I think that one's actually sort of a joke answer. It does come up from time to time for something along the lines of, "This is Shakespeare's worst play." It's something, So,
Oh man!
but opera. I mean, those are the big ones. So potent potables. That's sort of a classic Jeopardy category. That if I've been known to enjoy a drink from time to time. So that knowing the ingredients of certain drinks that helps. But I did have to study that a little bit. So these are, and of course, then you have the standard Jeopardy categories, the before and afters, and anagrams, which is my great weakness, even though it ended up coming up on my first show. So,
So obviously, you were cramming / studying for the substance of the show, but what about like the actual gameplay and the strategy? Was that something you were thinking about, like in preparation for the show? And if so, sort of like, what was your approach to that?
Sure. I mean, there's some accepted sort of common strategy that's like anything in 2018. The game has been broken down to a degree that would have been impossible 10, 15 years earlier by that kind of internet hive mind. So there's a certain strategy when it comes to daily doubles. I mean, there's I think one they call it the Forrest bounce, which goes back to a guy named Chuck Forrest that played in the 80s, and kind of his goal was clearly chasing after the daily doubles, figuring that that's where the most value could be had in the game. And then you have a guy named Roger Craig, who's another one of the Jeopardy greats, pioneered essentially the notion that you really should be going for the daily double, the true daily double at every opportunity. So that's sort of the game theory. Now, of course, that's easier said than done when the spotlights are on. I went in thinking if I landed on a daily double in round one, the conventional wisdom is that since only about 1/3 of the dollar values are in single Jeopardy, you may as well go for the true daily double in single Jeopardy, because you've got plenty of time and dollar amounts to make it up in the end. But when I found myself in that position and the lights were on and Trebek is eyeballing me, it was a little bit more difficult. So but
it paid off.
It did. Well, it ultimately, in the second round, I ultimately was able to pull the trigger and it worked out. But and then on the other side of it is the buzzer strategy. The buzzer is basically what a lot of folks don't realize is you're not allowed to ring in until Trebek finishes reading the question. So that's done for essentially for television purposes. From what I understand, in the 60s version of the show, hosted by a guy named Art Fleming, you could actually ring in as soon as you knew the answer, which was more like a common pub trivia game, but made for terrible television, because they were not getting the questions out. They were just talking over each other the whole time. So you got to wait for Trebek to finish, and you also have to, but you then need to be able to beat everybody else to the punch at that point. So the timing, there's like a 1/10 of a second window where you can get in, and that came and went for me.
Yeah, I noticed that. I mean, so can you like push the button multiple times while he's talking or something, or like is there any?
Yeah, you cannot. If you try to ring in while he's talking, you will be locked out for I think about 1/4 of a second, which in Jeopardy time is an eternity, and you're going to basically be out on that question. So you really need to hold your horses and time it just right.
Yeah. When I also noticed, maybe I'm wrong, but it seemed like when you were like ahead at certain points, you were like deliberately choosing lower value questions almost.
Yeah, no question about that. Once, in the first game, once I was pretty comfortably ahead and I had more than double the score of my opponents at that point, I was essentially trying to run out the clock. And so they were, I was picking the low dollar value questions in an attempt to essentially, I guess, take a knee and run out the clock. So,
okay, so not totally out to lunch. So you mentioned in some of our emails some of the history of game shows and sort of the background of Jeopardy, which was really interesting to me, and I thought was kind of a nice setup for thinking about like legal questions around game shows and Jeopardy in general. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about some of that and sort of like the kind of legal history of American game shows, as it were.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think what a lot of folks really the first sort of golden age of TV game shows came about in the 1950s, and then probably the most famous one was the $64,000 question or 21. And the same way that many years later, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire or A Deal or No Deal or Jeopardy in its time took over sort of the public consciousness. These shows, you remember, you're talking about the three network era, so this was dominating the public conversation, and some in that race for ratings that came at the time, some of the producers of those shows came to the conclusion, hey, wait a minute, we've got some really great trivia types that are extra successful on the show, but wouldn't it be better if we could find folks that were a little taller, a little blonder, a little more blue-eyed, a little bit more handsome, more classically handsome, and have them win these shows and get all this press attention? Wouldn't that get a few more eyeballs? So you got where they started feeding these folks the answers, and you had the most famous case, I think, was ultimately immortalized in the movie Quiz Show, 1994, and this was ultimately discovered, essentially came out through the media, and the folks that had, were on the wrong side of these rigged games eventually started talking to the press. And, simpler times, right? I mean, I think now we all think of reality TV where you just assume there's some level of manipulation going on behind the scenes. 1950s America, this, blew the doors off the place to such an extent that Congress felt compelled to act, which stuns me, from the point of view of 2018, that that this you managed to get an act of Congress to address this, and so but they did, and President Eisenhower, essentially on his way out the door, signed several amendments to the Communications Act of 1934, and the operative text of which essentially it says, it shall be unlawful for any person with intent to deceive the listening or viewing public to, among other things, supply to any contestant in a bona fide contest of intellectual knowledge or intellectual skill any special and secret assistance whereby the outcome of such contest will be in whole or in part prearranged or predetermined. So it is literally a federal offense to help someone cheat on
It's crazy.
on a TV game show. Now,
yeah, I mean, it's like the game show equivalent of payola plug-ola rules almost.
Yeah, I think that's right. Now, to the best of my knowledge, I was, and I looked, I cannot find any successful prosecutions or even indictments under this statute. If any of your listening public out there is aware of any, I'd love to hear about it.
Charbel, I smell a law review article here.
I tell you, it's but I think the net effect of it was it actually drove quiz shows off of television. I mean, the public was soured on them, and I think that's when it were largely replaced by I think variety shows, sort of the Ed Sullivan variety, and then ultimately on daytime TV by talk shows, sort of the Phil Donahue, Sally Jesse Raphael era. But time passes, and you have some creative folks that say, well, maybe it's time. Gosh, I really love those game shows, those trivia games, and what can we do? And you had a gentleman by the name of Merv Griffin. Of course, Merv Griffin best known as at least in his day, as a talk show host, although a very successful businessman. And he was brainstorming game show ideas with his wife, who was a big fan of the old quiz shows. And he said, well, honey, I love those shoes too, but since the $64,000 question, they won't let us do those trivia shows anymore because they suspect you've given the players the answers. Then she perks up and has a bright idea. Says, well, in that case, why don't you just give them the answers and make people come up with the questions? And that's how Jeopardy was born.
Wow. So great. Such a great story, Merv Griffin too, so from a lawyer's perspective, like, what was it like actually going on the show? Like the whole kind of procedure and the kind of contractual relationships or releases and waivers, like what were their expectations and were there any surprises?
Yeah. So, I think going in, knowing the background of this, I kind of was keeping my eyes open, and it was interesting to me to this day, decades after these game show scandals, the efforts that the Jeopardy producers took to maintain, the appearance or to avoid the appearance of impropriety, and the lengths that they went through from the very early stages of the application process, all the way through the taping day, all the way through airing. So, for example, taking it back to the application process, one of the things they ask you that will get you bounced pretty quickly from the process is, are you or a family member or even a friend an employee of Jeopardy, but also or its production companies, but also the third party compliance companies that work with Jeopardy, and I'll come back to those guys in a minute. But also Sony Picture Studios, CBS, the Associated Press, for some reason that I'm not entirely clear on. That's one of the ones they ask you about. And if any of those, you check the box yes on any one of those, I think, at some point, I think if you can explain it as maybe a pretty distant relationship. I know they actually just had a Jeopardy champion who's an AP reporter, for example. So I think that there's, at some level, maybe that's not a total block in your ability to play, but they're certainly cognizant of it in the very, very early stages, right? And then take that to when you get the phone call that you're going to be on the show. And again, the phone call came and said, well, hey, we've dusted off your application. It was about 2 years after my previous my interview in that case. So it had been quite a long wait. And he says, well, we
Wow.
brushed a lot of dust off your application. We just want to make sure you're still not employed by any of these entities. And so it's very much top of their mind. Again, just because I think they want to make sure there's no appearance of any kind of conflict. And then you get to game day itself. And that's when it really, I guess just before that, I guess I'll back up slightly. Before you play, they make you sign a fairly lengthy, essentially application. They call it application, release, and consent. There is, again, it's about a 30-page document, lengthy references to avoiding the appearance of impropriety, avoiding disparagement and conduct detrimental to the program, which, I think in our cynical times, gosh, you say, well, what are we talking about here? But, when you think about it, Jeopardy, it's one of the last great American institutions. It's one of the last. I mean, I don't want to oversell it, but I really do believe this. I mean, it's one of the top 10 most popular shows on TV, and I think a lot of that depends on folks the perception that it's an honest and true sort of merit-based process. So I'm totally sympathetic to that.
Yeah. I mean, geez, as a Gen Xer, man, Jeopardy was like iconic in my childhood,
Right. I mean, you think about it was, referenced in The Simpsons, referenced in Cheers, I mean, Mama's Family. I mean, come on, Mama's Family. So, and then of course, very lengthy indemnities and releases and an arbitration provision, and essentially also requiring that you do not reveal any results of the show or anything that really could give away any kind of spoiler type information, whether it's results of the game or questions from the game, anything along those lines. And of course, on the threat that they'll withhold any potential prize money.
So that's like that's like the leverage then that that you won't get paid if you break any of the rules.
Yeah, and what a lot of folks don't realize is everybody asks me, they said, well, it's Jeopardy, they must put you up at the Beverly Hilton or the Ritz while you're there. And the truth is, you actually have to pay your way out there. And they do give you a very nice Sony corporate discount at the Culver City DoubleTree, which is great, right? Exactly. But you're paying your own way and flying and hotel, and with the guarantee that third place gets $1,000. So eventually you'll recoup your investment even in the third place, but only about 4 months after the show airs. So that's the little bit of the hook that they put into it.
Yeah. Are you aware of anyone like violating the terms of any of these releases or consent forms?
There's kind of whispers. I mean, I think a lot of these don't necessarily come to the light of day. There's an interesting example. It's one of the sort of the mysteries. There was a champion, a recent champion, who I think he won some, impressive number of episodes, 10, 15, 20 episodes, who did not, typically when you're one of the more successful winners like that, they'll invite you back for, like a tournament of champions or some kind of special tournament where it's the best of the best. And there was, this was, the battle of the decades. And they had the great champs from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And he was one of the ones sort of prominently missing from the 2000s. And they even they went so far as to reference it on the show itself. And this is one of the few Jeopardy tournaments. It's actually on Netflix. So I encourage listeners to go check it out. It's actually reference made to it where they said, this champion didn't appear due to contractual differences. No, that's a little bit of a mystery. So.
Was there anything about any of the kind of formal documentation that was like surprising to you or something you didn't expect to see when you started the process?
Well, I think what I was, in terms of the documentation, I've seen enough non-disclosure confidentiality agreements in my day-to-day that it's so sort of commonplace in commerce today that it really didn't surprise me. I think some of the other contestants maybe did not expect such a lengthy legal documentation. I think what did surprise me was the lengths to which on the day of taping, the lengths to which they went to sequester the contestants and sort of avoid potential for either collusion or any kind of other cheating type behavior.
Okay. Well, a couple more questions from my wife, Katrina, as we wrap up the interview, because I thought they were actually really interesting, especially in relation to what you've said. One was she was wondering about the kind of the meet and greet, introduce yourself part of the show. Like, how did that work? How did they decide what you were going to talk about? Like, did they get it right? Did they try to change anything? Like, do you have a sense of like what the purpose of that part of the show is and how they think about it?
Sure. That's something that they actually ask you about. They ask you for 5 interesting facts about yourself, going all the way back to the interview process. So they really expect you walking in the door to have at least 5 solid, interesting anecdotes or factoids about yourself coming in the door, and that's all part of how you sell yourself to Jeopardy. So by the time game day comes, you should hopefully have those little stories pretty well polished, and then you sit with the contestant coordinators, and I got to give them a big shout out, because these are the coolest people, some of the most high energy folks you met in your life. Sort of the ringleader, sort of a well-known in Jeopardy circles. Her name is Maggie Speak, and she's kind of, imagine a combination of Janis Joplin and a fairy godmother, and just operating at high energy throughout. And so she's coaching you through the process and trying to coax a little bit of personality out of these hardcore trivia types. And part of that is, all right, well, let's talk about what you want to talk about with Alex. And they're going to give you, you're really at that point boiling down the list to three topics. And, mine, a question that I always get, what's the deal with my first name? What does Charbel mean? So I had that little bit of story on that. I also had, the first time that I actually appeared on network television was in the front row of a WWE event in 2012. That's pro wrestling for those folks not in on the lingo.
Wow. Who's in the match?
It was, I think the main event that night was John Cena, now sort of well known through, he's kind of the Hulk Hogan of the 2010s, right? Now kind of entering into Hollywood through all different angles. But at that time, so that was a big one. You got to see Cena up close and personal from the front row. My wife and I put on our, basically formal attire for that one. So anybody that can find that golden nugget on the WWE network, I recommend it. But and then the third one, I think I mentioned, that I was at the Game 7 of the 1997 World Series when the Florida Marlins beat the Cleveland Indians in the bottom of extra innings, and kind of what a crazy experience that was. But of course, Trebek ultimately, he looks at that list of three things, and he decides on the spot what he wants to talk to you about. So he's the boss.
Yeah, and he went with Charbel.
Yep. So I got to give Saint Charbel a shout out on national TV, which I'm pretty sure that's. And then later in the game, when I hit the True Daily double and doubled my $10,000, then all of a sudden Trebek at the end, the highlight of the show for me, he bellows, and Saint Charbel of Lebanon is smiling down upon you today. And that just
that was pretty great.
That was pretty cool. That's one for the books. So couldn't have scripted it better.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up with the most important question I'm going to ask you.
Sure. Mustache
or no mustache?
Oh, yeah. I'm gonna go with beard. I really like the Trebeard. I was a big fan. Unfortunately, Mrs. Trebek apparently was not, so I think she wins. But.
Oh well, Charbel, this has been fantastic. I really enjoyed talking to you about your Jeopardy experiences, and congratulations on being a Jeopardy champion.
Brian, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. This is a cool program, and I'm glad to be able to join you on it.
And when my work is done, I party hard, take my souped up poop out of my backyard, and burn up Rigatoni Boulevard. We're gonna fly tonight, cause we're doing the Melmac Rock. We're in the sky tonight, cause we're doing the Melmac Rock. From every corner of this galaxy, extraterrestrials will be rocking me. I got a pretty baby, sets my fur on fire. Her kisses burn like a telephone wire. Gonna tear up this town, we're gonna paint it blue. The cats are jumping 'cause we're coming through. We're gonna shout tonight 'cause we're doing the Melmac Rock. Check it out tonight 'cause we're doing the Melmac Rock. Shake it to the rhythm of my guitar. Say hi to a real live shooting star. Rock it to me, baby, 'cause we're doing the Melmac Rock. We're gonna dance tonight 'cause we're doing the Melmac Rock. Take a chance tonight 'cause we're doing the Melmac Rock. So call in sick, take a holiday. We're gonna put some chocolate syrup in that Milky Way. So rock it to me, baby, 'cause we're doing the Melmac Rock. Hey, check this out. My fingers aren't even touching the strings. This one's destined for the charts. Which chart I won't say. You know, being a rock star is kind of fun. Think I'll keep the outfit. Maybe I'll dye my hair pink.